There are moments in life when we find ourselves at a crossroads, facing choices that seem to require our immediate attention. These are the times when our thoughts race, when we feel the urgency of our circumstances pressing upon us, and when we wonder which direction is the right one. In these moments, it is easy to become consumed by our desires, by what we want or think we need. We are so often guided by our immediate wants or fears, and it is in these impulses that we risk losing sight of the deeper, higher purpose that might be calling us. However, if we are truly listening to God's voice, it leads us away from the pull of personal gain and towards something greater than ourselves. At the heart of the difference between our thoughts and God's voice is the distinction between the desires of the self and the invitation to something more expansive and profound. When we listen to our own thoughts, they are often shaped by what we need right now. We want to be comfortable. We want security. We want to fulfill our desires, whether it's for success, approval, or possession. These desires, though not inherently wrong, are limited to our own sense of what we think will bring us happiness. But God's voice, when we hear it clearly, pulls us away from this narrow focus and calls us to a higher purpose that often transcends our own immediate wants. In these moments, God's voice does not simply echo our personal desires. Rather, it leads us to something deeper, something that calls us to think beyond ourselves. The voice of God does not simply tell us to satisfy our needs, but challenges us to consider how our actions impact the world around us, how they might help those in need, or how they may serve a greater good. God's voice calls us to look beyond the confines of our own personal success and consider the broader implications of our decisions. It is not that personal success or security are wrong, but when these are our only motivations, we miss out on the greater, deeper fulfillment that comes from aligning ourselves with a higher purpose. There is a peace that comes from living in accordance with this purpose, a peace that transcends the satisfaction of personal desires and provides us with a sense of fulfillment that no amount of success or comfort can bring. This peace comes when we align ourselves with God's voice, when we follow its gentle guidance away from self-interest and toward a life of service, humility, and love. Think about the many choices we face every day. Some are small and seemingly insignificant, while others are life-changing. In these moments, we often turn inward, seeking answers from our own minds. We weigh the pros and cons, consider the benefits to ourselves, and ultimately make decisions that serve our immediate needs. But when God speaks to us, it is often with a sense of calling to something much greater. He does not offer us simple answers for personal gain, but it invites us into a life that involves sacrifice, patience, and trust. This higher purpose often pulls us out of our comfort zone and challenges us to take steps that might not immediately make sense in the light of our own desires. Yet it is in these steps that we find true fulfillment. For God's purpose always seeks the good of others and the greater good of the world. One of the most profound aspects of hearing God's voice is that it directs us toward selflessness, not selfishness. It calls us away from a life centered on personal accumulation and instead invites us into a life of giving. God's voice does not encourage us to hoard, to prioritize our own needs at the expense of others, or to chase after fleeting comforts. Instead, it urges us to live with an open hand, ready to serve, to love, and to contribute to the good of others. This kind of life often feels counterintuitive. It feels unnatural in a world that constantly pulls us toward individualism and the pursuit of personal gain. Yet when we follow God's voice, we realize that this is where true joy lies. Not in selfish ambition, but in aligning ourselves with a purpose that is larger than we are. This calling is not always easy, and it often does not make sense according to the logic of the world. When we listen to our own thoughts, we are often motivated by what seems most practical or advantageous in the moment. We are driven by what feels good or what promises security. But God's voice often leads us down paths that require trust, that ask us to step out in faith, even when the outcome is uncertain. It may ask us to take a risk, to surrender our own desires for the good of others, or to follow a path that requires sacrifice. And in these moments, we are challenged to trust that God's way is better, that the higher purpose He calls us to will bring about a deeper fulfillment than any personal achievement could offer. When we listen carefully to God's voice, we begin to recognize that it consistently calls us away from selfishness and towards selflessness. It invites us to a life that is marked not by personal ambition, but by the well-being of others. God's voice calls us to act with compassion, to seek justice, to love our neighbors, and to serve those in need. It leads us into relationships that reflect His love and into actions that reflect His goodness. When we follow His voice, we find ourselves drawn into a greater story, a narrative that is not centered on our own lives, but on the flourishing of all people and the restoration of the world around us. It is in this higher calling that we find true meaning and fulfillment. The pursuit of personal gain can never satisfy the deeper longing of the soul. But when we align ourselves with God's voice and His higher purpose, we find that our lives are not just about us. They are about the impact we can make on others, the good we can bring into the world, and the ways in which we can participate in God's work of love and justice. This higher calling transcends the fleeting desires of the self and invites us to live with a sense of purpose and meaning that far exceeds anything we could achieve on our own. In this way, God's voice is always an invitation to something greater than our own desires. It calls us to move beyond the confines of self-interest and into a life that seeks the good of others and the fulfillment of a higher purpose. It leads us away from the pull of selfish ambition and into the peace that comes from aligning ourselves with God's eternal plan. When we listen to God's voice, we discover that there is a greater joy, a deeper peace, and a more profound fulfillment that comes not from what we can accumulate for ourselves, but from how we live in service to others and to God's greater purpose for the world. When we try to distinguish between God's voice and our own thoughts, one of the most important tools we have is the process of reflection. Our thoughts, shaped by the daily grind of life, often reflect our immediate desires, fears, and insecurities. They are transient and fluctuating, rising and falling with our moods and circumstances. These thoughts can feel urgent and pressing, demanding our attention and leading us in different directions depending on what we desire or fear at the moment. In contrast, God's voice speaks with a quiet constancy, and it is often only through careful reflection that we begin to recognize it for what it truly is. The challenge lies in the fact that our thoughts can sometimes mimic the clarity of God's voice, especially when we are desperately seeking answers or guidance. Our minds, conditioned by the world and its demands, are accustomed to instant answers and solutions, and they can convince us that the first impulse or reaction we have is the correct one. This is why we must take time to reflect and to truly sit with our thoughts, allowing them to settle before we act. In the midst of our emotional turbulence and mental noise, God's voice will often feel like a calm presence. But we may mistake it for just another passing thought if we do not give ourselves time to pause. and reflect. Reflection is a process that requires patience. We are not always able to discern the difference between God's voice and our own thoughts in an instant, especially when we are under pressure or feeling the weight of uncertainty. It is only in the stillness, the slowing down of our minds, that we allow God's voice to come into clearer focus. When we pause and reflect, we begin to separate the fleeting, often self-centered thoughts from the steady, peaceful direction that God provides. The practice of reflection allows us to discern the difference between the selfish desires of the mind and the selfless call of God. Autism is dangerously confusing for the heart. By this time of the day, God's voice, however, does not emerge from this emotional chaos. Namely, God's voice, however, does not emerge from this emotional chaos when we are overwhelmed by emotion. Our thoughts become clouded and we may find ourselves caught in cycles of indecision or impulsive reactions. God's voice, however, does not emerge from this emotional chaos. We have to notice it speaks quietly, yet with an authority that transcends our emotional states. Reflection allows us to sift through the clutter of our emotions and see God's voice for what it is, a voice that does not rush us, does not manipulate us, and does not take advantage of our weaknesses. It is a voice that calls us to trust, to wait, and to act in love. The act of reflection helps us to tune in to the deeper places of our hearts, where God's voice speaks. It invites us to look beyond the surface of our thoughts and into the deeper motivations that drive us. It is not always easy to face these deeper motivations, for they are often rooted in our desires for control, approval, or comfort. But it is only through this kind of reflection that we begin to hear God's voice, because His call is not rooted in our temporary needs or wants, but in our long-term transformation. God's voice does not come to affirm our desires for security or success, but to challenge us to grow beyond the limits of our own thinking and to trust in something much bigger than ourselves. When we reflect, we open ourselves up to this higher call, and in doing so, we can begin to discern it more clearly. Reflection also helps us recognize the lasting nature of God's voice. Our thoughts are often fleeting, momentary, and driven by our changing circumstances. What we think is important today may lose its significance tomorrow. However, God's voice speaks to us with a sense of permanence and continuity. It does not change based on how we feel or what we think we need at any given moment. Instead, it is a voice that invites us to a steady, unchanging purpose, a purpose that transcends the momentary concerns of our lives. Through reflection, we begin to notice that God's voice remains consistent, even when our thoughts are all over the place. This consistency is one of the key ways we can distinguish God's voice from our own. The clarity and peace that come with hearing God's voice are not dependent on our emotional highs or lows. Whether we are feeling joyful or anxious, God's voice is the same. It remains calm and reassuring. Our thoughts, however, fluctuate with the ups and downs of life, and they often lead us in directions that may seem right in the moment, but do not provide lasting peace or clarity. Reflection allows us to sit with these varying thoughts long enough to discern which ones are truly leading us toward peace and which ones are merely reactive. In the practice of reflection, we also find the ability to test and measure the fruits of our thoughts. When we reflect, we begin to see whether the thoughts we have lead us toward love, kindness, patience, and humility, traits that are consistent with God's will, or whether they lead us to selfishness, impatience, and self-interest. Reflection helps us to understand the nature of our thoughts and motivations. We begin to see whether we are acting out of a desire to control, to protect our own comfort, or to serve others in love. When we measure the fruits of our thoughts against the steady, peaceful guidance of God's voice, we can better discern whether we are being led by our own impulses or by the call to something higher. God's voice does not rush us or demand quick decisions. It gently encourages us to reflect, to consider our choices carefully, and to trust that when we listen attentively, we will know the next step. Reflection is not about analyzing or overthinking, but about giving space for God to speak clearly amidst the clutter of our thoughts. It requires us to slow down and wait, trusting that in the silence we will find direction. In the midst of life's struggles, there is often the subtle yet powerful invitation from God, the invitation to serve others. It may not always be obvious or glamorous, and in many ways it runs counter to the world's values, which often prioritize self-promotion and personal gain. But there is a truth that runs deeper than the fleeting desires of the world. True greatness is not found in elevating ourselves, but in lifting others up. In a culture that constantly tells us to put ourselves first, to chase after fame and recognition, we are reminded by God that the path to true greatness is paved with humility, selflessness, and love for others. When we think about greatness, we are often drawn to the idea of power, prestige, and success. We are taught to measure ourselves by our achievements, the size of our bank account, our social status, or the titles we carry. Yet God's definition of greatness is vastly different from the world's. In the kingdom of God, greatness is not measured by how many people serve us, but by how many people we serve. It is not about getting ahead of others, but about putting ourselves last. This idea is revolutionary, even radical, and it challenges us to look beyond our own desires and ambitions, and instead focus on the needs of others. We've got the secret to embracing this calling is understanding that serving others is not just a noble ideal, it is a command from God. Jesus, who is the ultimate example of humility and service, made this clear when he washed the feet of his disciples, a task that was considered the lowliest of chores. In that moment, he modeled the kind of service that defines greatness in God's eyes. It is not about status, it is about love. It is not about personal gain, it is about giving without expecting anything in return. Jesus, the Son of God, could have chosen any form of greatness, yet he chose to serve. And in doing so, he turned the world's idea of greatness upside down. To serve others is to align ourselves with God's heart for the world. It means seeing beyond our own needs and desires and recognizing the needs of those around us. Service is not always easy, nor is it always convenient. It often requires sacrifice, humility, and the willingness to give of ourselves when we might prefer to focus on our own lives. But it is in these very moments of sacrifice when we might prefer to focus on our own lives. But it is in these very moments of sacrifice that we reflect God's love most powerfully. Serving others calls us to lay down our own preferences, to step outside of our comfort zones, and to act out of compassion for the pain and struggles of those around us. The world may tell us that success is about achieving great things for ourselves, but God shows us that success is found in the small, quiet acts of service. Whether it's helping a neighbor in need, supporting a friend through a difficult time, or offering a kind word to someone who feels forgotten. These seemingly insignificant acts of service have the power to change lives. We often underestimate the impact of these small moments. In God's economy, there is no act of service that is too small or too insignificant. Every act of love, no matter how seemingly trivial, matters deeply to God. Serving others also has the power to transform us. It stretches us, shapes us, and molds us into the image of Christ. When we choose to serve, we are reminded that we are not the center of the universe, and we learn to see the world through the eyes of others. Serving allows us to step outside of ourselves and to truly listen, to empathize, and to understand the pain and struggles that others are facing. It opens our hearts to the suffering of the world, and in doing so, it draws us closer to the heart of God. As we serve, we are reminded of the ultimate act of service that Jesus made on our behalf, his sacrificial death on the cross. The more we serve, the more we become like Christ. This process of becoming more like him is not a one-time event, but a lifelong journey. It requires constant humility, a willingness to put others before ourselves, and the ability to look beyond our own ambitions and desires. But as we serve, we also find joy. It is in giving that we receive. When we serve others, we experience the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing we are making a difference, however small. Serving is not always easy, but it is always fulfilling. It reminds us that our lives are not meant to be lived for our own gain, but for the good of others. Service also has the power to break down barriers. It unites us across lines of race, class, and background, reminding us that we are all part of one human family. When we serve, we see others not as strangers or competitors, but as fellow image bearers of God. Service helps to dissolve the walls that divide us, and it fosters a spirit of community and solidarity. It teaches us that we are not alone in this world, that we are all connected, and that we are called to care for one another. The true power of service is revealed when we serve without expecting anything in return. The world tells us that we should only give when we will receive something in return. But God calls us to a higher standard. We are called to serve because it reflects God's love, not because we expect recognition or rewards. The act of serving others is not about making ourselves feel better or about earning points with God. It is about reflecting his love and generosity to a world in desperate need of both. When we serve without strings attached, we are able to reflect the unconditional love that God has shown to us. As we embrace this call to service, we must also remember that serving others is not always about doing grand, life-changing acts. It is often about the simple, everyday moments where we choose to show up for others, to listen and to care. It is in these small acts of service that we truly make a difference. When we serve with love and humility, we are participating in God's redemptive work in the world. We are helping to bring his kingdom to earth, one act of kindness at a time. When we choose to serve, we are also making a statement about the kind of people we want to be. We are choosing to live according to God's values, not the world's. We are choosing humility over pride, selflessness over selfishness, and love over apathy. The world may tell us that greatness is about power and prestige, but God's definition of greatness is found in serving others with a heart full of love and compassion. This call to serve is not just for a select few, it is for all of us. Every person has something to offer, whether it is time, resources, or simply a listening ear. When we serve, we participate in the divine work of caring for others, of meeting their needs, and of making the world a better place. In serving others, we are not just meeting their needs, we are also fulfilling our own deepest calling to love and to reflect God's love to the world. When we embrace the call to serve, we step into the fullness of our purpose. We step into the work that God has prepared for us, and in doing so, we find true fulfillment and joy. The road to greatness may not be what the world expects, but it is the road that leads us to a life of purpose, peace, and deep satisfaction. At the core of our faith, there is a truth that is overlooked, a truth that has the power to change everything. We are never alone. It is easy in the midst of our struggles, our disappointments, and our fears to believe that we are walking this path by ourselves. We look around us and see others who seem to have it all together, who seem to be thriving in ways that we are not. And we begin to feel isolated. We may wonder why we can't see the way forward, or why things seem so unclear. In these moments, the enemy whispers lies, telling us that we are alone, that God has forgotten us, or that we are not worthy of his presence. But the truth, the undeniable truth, is that God is always with us, even when we cannot see him, feel him, or understand his plan. This truth is woven throughout Scripture. From the very beginning, God promised to never leave or forsake his people. In the Old Testament, he was with the Israelites in their wilderness wanderings, leading them with a cloud by day and a fire by night. Even in the hardest moments when they felt abandoned or lost, God was present, guiding them with his love and protection. In the New Testament, Jesus made it clear that he would be with us always, even to the end of the age. He didn't promise that we would be free from trials or hardship, but he did promise that he would be with us in every moment, walking beside us, comforting us, and strengthening us. This is the unshakable foundation of our faith. God is always with us. The reality is, we often forget this truth, especially when life gets hard, when we face difficulties that seem insurmountable, when the road ahead appears uncertain, or when we are overwhelmed by the weight of our own emotions. The idea that we are not alone doesn't mean that life will be without difficulty. Rather, it means that no matter how difficult the journey, we do not walk it alone. 67. God's presence is not always loud and overwhelming. Often it is quiet, gentle, and still. We may not always feel his presence in the way we expect or desire, but that does not mean he is absent. Sometimes his presence comes through a kind word from a friend, through a moment of peace in the midst of chaos, or through a sense of knowing that we are being held in his care. His presence is in the small, everyday moments, in the ways he sustains us even when we cannot see the full picture. There is power in knowing that we are not alone. When we remember that God is with us, it changes the way we approach life. It changes how we face challenges, how we react to setbacks, and how we move through our day. We no longer have to face the world with a sense of fear or uncertainty, because we know that God is by our side. In his presence we find strength, comfort, and courage. We are not left to navigate life's difficulties on our own. We have a constant companion, one who knows us intimately and loves us unconditionally. Knowing that God is with us also invites us into a deeper relationship with him. It calls us to draw near to him, to trust in his guidance, and to listen for his voice. When we are aware of his presence, we are more attuned to his leading, more open to his whispers, and more willing to follow wherever he leads. The presence of God is not just something we receive, it is something we participate in. As we become more aware of his nearness, we find that our lives are transformed, that we begin to see the world through his eyes, and that we are filled with a deeper sense of peace and purpose. And the very thing I suspect, the presence of God is not just a comfort in times of difficulty, it is a strength in times of joy as well. When we experience moments of celebration, when things go well and life is good, it is easy to forget that God is with us in those moments too. But he is. His presence is with us in every season of life, whether in the highs or the lows. It is his presence that gives us the ability to enjoy life fully, to rejoice in the good things, and to give thanks in all circumstances. It is also important to remember that being with us does not always mean that God will remove all of our struggles. Sometimes His presence means that He will walk with us through our difficulties, offering comfort and peace in the midst of them. Sometimes He will carry us when we cannot carry ourselves, strengthening us to endure and persevere. His presence does not guarantee an easy life, but it does guarantee that we are never alone. God's presence is a constant source of hope, peace, and strength. It is the foundation upon which we can stand firm, even in the midst of life's storms. When we realize that we are never truly alone, it changes everything. It frees us from the fear of abandonment and the weight of isolation, and from the lie that we are forgotten. It helps us to remember that we are part of something greater than ourselves, that we are not just individuals trying to make our way through the world, but beloved children of a God who is always near. Knowing that God is with us invites us into a life of trust, of surrender, and of peace. It calls us to lean into His presence, to rest in His love, and to walk with Him every step of the way.